Good Without God, that's a book of the same title that I ran into. It was written by a humanist chaplain at Harvard University. And his name is Greg Epstein. This is the first book I read on actual humanism, and I discovered that I agree with many of the things that Mr. Epstein has to express. I won't quite call myself a humanist yet, but I'm definitely embracing many of the thoughts that are in there. So for the purpose of today's talk, when I say I, or when I say we humanists, I speak as Mr. Epstein. All right. I also realized that there's so much in the book, it's impossible to just cover that in one talk. So I will touch on some topics today and maybe talk more in the future, talk about some of the details. So, can one be good without God? That question does not need to be answered. It needs to be rejected outright. To suggest that one cannot be good without belief in God is not just an opinion, it's a prejudice. It may even be a discrimination. After all, would you ever ask, is it possible to be a good person if you are a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or Jewish, or Christian? Would you feel comfortable working for an employer who implied that all gays and lesbians are immoral, or all Democrats, or all Republicans? How would you feel if your daughter were planning to marry someone who claimed that all Catholics were lousy, unethical human beings, or all Protestants? This is the sort of all or nothing condemnation of a huge population one is making if one suggests that goodness and morality require belief in a deity. And it is hardly a hypothetical question. Over decades of polling, a majority of Americans have consistently indicated a negative opinion of atheists and non-believers. Even in this enlightened 21st century, where we proved ourselves ready for a black president and have welcomed elected officials representing almost every diverse group in the country, approximately half of all Americans say they would refuse to vote for a well-qualified atheist candidate for public office. In other words, 1 out of every 2 Americans admits to be prejudiced against fellow citizens who don't believe in God. No other minority group in this country is rejected by such large numbers. This prejudice ought to concern us all, because prejudice anywhere endangers not only its targets, but all who believe that we should be judged by the content of our character rather than by our religious preference or lack thereof. If we can convince ourselves today that one entire group comprising millions of people might be incapable of goodness or might be no good, then we harbor inside us the ability to turn against and hate any other group as well, and no one should feel safe. It is not easy to live a good life or be a good person, with or without God. The fact is that life is hard. Living well and being a good person is difficult to do. But that doesn't mean we should give ourselves permission to judge an entire group of people as incapable of goodness unless they are being good the majority's way. Tolerant, fair-minded people of all beliefs do not dwell on the question of whether we can be good without God. The answer is yes, period. Millions and millions of people are, every day. However, the question why we can be good without God is much more relevant and interesting. And the question of how we can be good without God is absolutely crucial. Those are the essential questions asked and answered by humanism. Today, I invite you to explore these questions with me and some of humanism's answers. Are you religious? If you're not religious, if you don't believe in God, or if you're not sure you believe in God, or if you think you believe in some kind of higher power, but you know you don't fit into any organized religion, you're not alone. Here's the good news. Over 1 billion people around the world today are like you. All the major studies of world religious demographics indicate that there are somewhere around 1 billion people on earth who define themselves as atheist, agnostic, or non-religious. Even if we exclude those non-religious people who say they believe in some form of spirit, there are still 500 million people in the world who live without belief in God. And even in the United States of America, which is the most religious of all the world developed nations, the non-religious now represent approximately 15% of the population, or approximately 40 million Americans. Non-religious is the fastest growing religious preference in the United States, and the only one to have increased its percentage of the population in every one of the 50 states over the past generation. Almost 1 in 4 American adults today has no religion. This growing trend suggests that the next generation will see an even larger percentage of the United States to be secular. Granted, when pollsters ask Americans to identify themselves as atheists or agnostics, only a few million answer yes. But those terms are attached to a stigma. When poll questions ask in a more roundabout way, such as, do you believe in God? The numbers who say no or not sure, that number is much higher. And the number of Americans who don't expect to have a religious funeral is way high, nearly a quarter of us. What's more, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that non-religious people are being good en masse. It has long been known that humanists and non-religious people have made extraordinary contributions to science and philosophy, as well as to philanthropy and social justice. But recently, sociologists have begun to pay more attention to the fact that some of the world's most secular countries, such as those in Scandinavia, are among the least violent, best educated, and most likely to care for the poor. Non-religious Americans have been shown to be far more likely than regular church-going believers to oppose, for example, US government sponsors torture or advanced interrogation techniques. And as scientists are now beginning to document, though religion may have benefits for the brain, so may have secularism and humanism. Atheists meditating on positive secular images can gain the same benefits that religious people do from prayer. Strongly convinced non-believers may be among the least depressed people, along with strongly convinced believers. Some say that non-religious people have nothing in common beyond their non-belief, and since they don't call themselves by the same names or join the same organization, they should not be counted or studied. This is nonsense, of course. After all, other faith traditions are incredibly diverse also. Hinduism, for example, with its thousands of gods and traditions, which many of its followers have trouble agreeing upon. Christianity also encompasses beliefs, customs, and organizations that range widely, from arch-liberal Unitarian Universalist in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to African American Baptists in Montgomery, Alabama, to Mormons in Salt Lake City, and far beyond. If Hinduism or Christianity can be studied as a big tent tradition, so can be the non-religious. We may be a diverse group, but no more so than others. Still, up to now, only a small percentage of the so-called non-believers have seen themselves as part of a bigger group of like-minded people, let alone a movement capable of improving people's perception of them or making the world a better place. Are you a humanist? Humanist, that's the proper term. If you identify as an atheist, agnostic, free thinker, rationalist, skeptic, cynic, secular humanist, naturalist, or deist, or if you describe yourself as spiritual, apathetic, non-religious, nothing, or other irreligious descriptive, you could probably count yourself what I call a humanist. Feel free to use whatever terminology you prefer. That is not important. It is not necessary to reach universal agreement about nomenclature in order to bring a massive group together to gain influence and recognition. As we have seen, for example, in recent years with the success of the GLBT movement, or is it LGBT, or gay, or queer? The point is that as a humanist, you would be in distinguished company along with Thomas Jefferson, John Lennon, Winston Churchill, Jean-Paul Sartre, Voltaire, David Hume, Salman Rushdie, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Confucius, Kurt Vonnegut, Mark Twain, Margaret Mead, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin, and more than 1 billion people worldwide. All this makes you and me adherents of one of the 4 largest life stances on earth, along with Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. But if we are adherents, what is it that we adhere to? What, if anything, do we have in common? Do we non-believers share any common beliefs? In recent times, we are beginning to gain recognition, such as a positive mention in President Obama's inaugural address, or a story about us on the front page of the New York Times. It is time to recognize that non-believers are believers too. We believe in humanism. What is humanism? Humanism is a bold, resolute response to the fact that being a human being can be lonely and frightening. We humanists take one look at the world in which the lives of thousands of innocent children are ripped away every year by hurricanes, earthquakes, and other acts of God. Not to mention the 1,000 other fundamental injustices in life. And we conclude that if the universe we live in does not have competent moral management, then so be it. We must become the superintendents of our own lives. Humanism means taking charge of the often lousy world around us and working to shape it into a better place, though we know we cannot ever finish the task. In short, humanism is being good without God. It is above all an affirmation of the greatest common value we human beings have: the desire to live with dignity, to be good. But humanism is also a warning that we cannot afford to wait until tomorrow or until the next life to be good, because today, that is the short journey we get from birth to death, from womb to tomb, today is all we have. Humanism rejects dependence on faith, the supernatural, divine texts, resurrection, reincarnation, or anything else for which we have no evidence. To put it another way, humanists believe in life before death. More formally, the American Humanist Association defines humanism as a progressive life stance that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment, aspiring to the greater good of humanity. This approach, though affirmed by most of the world's hundreds of millions of atheists and agnostics, is not particularly organized. And yet it can be, and it already is in many places, though some secularists bristle at the thought that this is too much like an organized religion. As we'll see, humanism is a cohesive world movement based on the creation of good lives and communities without God. Non-religious people often wonder why on earth, with all the abuses and scandals and illogical ideas that religion is responsible for, why is religion still so powerful? The answer is that for most, religion is not about belief in an all-seeing deity with a baritone voice and a flowing beard. It's about group identification, the community and the connections we need to live. It's about family, tradition, consolation, ethics, memories, music, art, architecture, and much more. These things are all good, and no one wants to or should be asked to give them up because of lack of belief in God. The truth is that at the present time, this list of social goods is difficult to find communally outside of traditional forms of religious affiliation or custom. And in truth, being a good person in a vacuum is not a very satisfying experience. Those of us who don't want to worship an invisible being or spend our days fretting about punishment in Hades do want to be able to share what we hold dear with our families and the broader world. And we want to be understood and appreciated for who we are. To do so, we need community. At the most important times of our lives, when we or our loved ones are sick and dying, when a new baby is born, when we want to affirm our love in marriage, when we want to educate our children not only about facts and dates, but also about important values. At these times, we need to be part of a group. We need what can be found or created in a humanist community, a place where family, memory, ethical values, and the uplifting of the human spirit can come together with intellectual honesty and without God. Is humanism a faith? I'm often asked whether humanism is a religion. Practically speaking, humanism is not a religion because most of us associate the word religion with a system that includes divinities and the supernatural. Humanists have no popes and no perfect people. As the intentionally silly t-shirt says, we are a non-profit organization. Sociologically speaking, however, humanism is similar to a religion in the way that it involves shared values with efforts to organize or a community and is essentially a way of life. So instead of religion, I prefer the European term life stance, meaning more than philosophy, but not a divine or revealed religion. In any case, asking whether humanism is a religion or not is little more than a semantic gotcha game. Right? Some ask because they are religious and are trying to knock humanism down a peg. Others are angry at religious hypocrisy and are afraid to be associated with anything that even faintly smells of belief, a word that is laden with baggage and unhappiness. But the point is not whether you believe in something, it's what you believe in. Not believing in anything is a belief too. That is nihilism. As TV and film writer, director John Whedon says, the enemy of humanism is not faith. The enemy of humanism is hate, is fear, is ignorance, It is the darker part of humankind that is in every humanist and every person in the world. But faith is something that we have to embrace. Faith in God means absolutely believing in something with no proof whatsoever. Faith in humanity means absolutely believing in something with a huge amount of proof to the contrary. As humanists, we are the true believers. How is humanism different from the new atheism? So much has been written about religious people and traditions of the world. Thousands of anthropologists and sociologists have devoted their lives to studying religious traditions and their adherents. Millions and millions of pages have been written about theology, about what religious people believe. But try to go to your local bookstore or library and ask for a book about non-religious people and what we believe. The choices have always been scant, indeed. So no wonder that the recent spate of best-selling books by atheists attacking religion has caused such a stir. Today, those who believe that the good life ought to be defined as obedience to God and tradition feel under siege by the forces of modernity. In their minds, certain outward signs of this modernity, whether gay pride parades, a woman rearing a child on her own, or simply people like me who can publicly deny a belief in God and live respectable lives, all are declarations of war against the old ways. And so both fundamentalist Islam and fundamentalist Christianity, among other religious forces, have declared war on secularism and humanism. In turn, a group of bold new atheist intellectuals has arisen to declare war right back, proclaiming God is not great, God is a delusion, and this is the end of faith. I admire today's new atheists because they seek to right the very many religious wrongs of our time. And I especially appreciate Messrs. Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, and others when they liberate young people to feel good to be open about their lack of belief in God, at a time when many still live in communities that shun those who will not produce at least an outward display of allegiance to the old values. But atheism goes astray when it adopts a certain posture such as displayed in the headline of a cover story in Wired magazine. The new atheism, no heaven, no hell, just science. What is science? Science has been called the religion of skepticism. Scott Peck defines the scientific method as a collection of conventions and procedures that have been designed in the interest of truth to combat our extraordinary capacity to deceive ourselves. It is true and important that humanists don't adhere to the idea of a heaven or a hell, and it is also true that we value science as the best tool humans have for understanding the world around us. But just science? Such language raises concerns that the new atheism is cut off from emotion, from intuition, and from a spirit of generosity toward those who see the world differently. While non-religious people often value science highly, many deeply religious people value and study it as well. So surely valuing science cannot be a way to distinguish religious people from non-religious people. Besides, books on science, though often containing much useful information about the world around us, can less often say important things about what we ought to value most in our life or why. Science can teach us a great deal, like what medicine to give to patients in a hospital. But science won't come and visit us in the hospital. So humanism goes well beyond just science. The history of goodness without God is a world tradition, has roots in the ancient East and West. Humanism traces its roots back not only to the European Enlightenment and to ancient Greece, but also touches cultures from India, China, and the Middle East. It is a belief held by American revolutionary patriots like Thomas Jefferson, leading women's suffragists of the 19th century, civil rights leaders of the 20th century, and on to the original new atheist, not only Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, and Harris, but also Freud, Marx, Nietzsche, and Darwin. So why do we want to be good with or without God? We will investigate this question later in more depth, but for now, we recognize that religion is a profound source of meaning and purpose for many people, even for those who have some skepticism about its supernatural claims, but fear that without religion, there is simply no reason to live, or at least no reason to live morally and ethically. One example for this view is the very influential Reverend Rick Warren, who has repeatedly stated that he could never vote for an atheist as President of the United States. In his best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life, he writes, "If your time on earth were all there is to your life, I would suggest that you start living it up immediately. You could forget about being good and ethical, and you wouldn't have to worry about any consequences of your actions. You could indulge yourself in total self-centeredness because your actions would have no long-term repercussions. But, and this makes all the difference, death is not the end of you. Death is not your termination, but your transition into eternity, so there are eternal consequences to everything you do on earth. Every act of your life strikes some chords that will vibrate in eternity." End of quote. So for many people, their purpose in life is driven by the concept of an afterlife and fear of eternal damnation. But for those of us who don't believe in a single overarching purpose given to us from up high, a humanistic approach to life can provide non-religious people with a profound and sustaining sense that we can and must live our lives for a purpose well beyond ourselves. But it's not enough to just discover the meaning of life. What really matters is whether we live according to our values, and that takes hard work and many hard choices every day. What is good without God? From learning how to put the golden rule and human compassion into action more often, to explore innovative and sustainable answers to new human problems, such as climate change and other bioethical dilemmas, humanism is concerned with one of the most important ethical questions: what we do when we found purpose in life. It is also important to acknowledge people who consider themselves religious. Welcome. I hope Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, Baha'is, and many others will study humanism, not to be converted or deconverted, but to gain understanding of loved ones and neighbors who may be humanists. I want to offer an affirmative response to the question of, can we be good with God? I urge atheists and agnostics to strive for religious literacy. And I implore religious people and humanists to enter into deeper dialogue and cooperation, because we live in a world that is small, interconnected, interdependent, and not to mention armed to the teeth with weapons of mass destruction. A world where we can no longer afford to misunderstand one another or to be ignorant about what makes each other tick. I believe that community is the heart of humanism. In the past century, God was supposed to be dead, but too often it has seemed that humanism died instead. What will it take for a new humanism to arise? One that is diverse, inclusive, inspiring, and a transformative force in the world today. If my work accomplishes one thing for the billion non-religious people, let it not be that we learn how better to convince others there is no God or that religion is evil. May we instead encourage more hospital visits by the non-religious, both literally and metaphorically. May we do more good work together and build something positive in this world, the only world we will ever have. May we focus more on the good than the without God.